Our reading is an interpretation of Psalm 8. Many named one, beyond imagining. When I contemplate the night sky, the cosmos, which all unfolded from a speck, galaxies, stars, this beautiful earth. Who are we humans that you attend to us? Mere mortals in our tiny corner, and you love us? We are life come to knowing and feeling. The whole world is in our hands, plants and animals, oceans and ice caps, rainforests, atmosphere and ecosystem. Touch our hearts, O God, make us worthy of this trust. Help us care for life on this beautiful earth. Now this next one is by St. Francis himself. I once spoke to my friend, an old squirrel, about the sacraments. He got so excited and ran into a hollow in his tree and came back holding some acorns, an owl feather, and a ribbon he had found. And I just smiled and said, "Yes, dear, you understand. Everything imparts His grace." A wee thing to note about St. Francis was that he first started preaching to the birds before he started preaching to the poor. And he didn't have permission to preach to anybody. It didn't stop him. He's very much the holy fool, and that comes across in this beautiful, I love this. And then one more, which is a bit more contemporary. This is Thomas Merton. There's a little picture of him there. He was a monk who died in the 1960s. But I think this really captures some of the Franciscan way. The pale flowers of the dogwood outside this window are saints. The bass and trout hiding in the deep pools of the river are canonized by their beauty and their strength. The lakes hidden among the hills are saints, and the sea too is a saint who praises God without interruption in her majestic dance. For me, to be a saint means to be myself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and discovering my true self. Trees and animals have no problem. God makes them what they are without consulting them, and they are perfectly satisfied. With us, it is different. God leaves us free to be whatever we like. We can be ourselves or not, as we please. We are at liberty to be real or to be unreal. We may be true or false. The choice is ours. Today I wanted to share a few of the components around Franciscan spirituality that really speak to me, and especially answering that mystery that in his conversion, Francis was praying in a falling down church, and he heard the crucifix on the wall speak to him, and it said, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my house, which as you can see is falling into ruins." Now, Francis understood this as, oh, I better rebuild the physical church. And that's what he did first. He just rushes out and answers the call. But for us all these years later, and for him later in his life, it was really clear that was a metaphor around the church and the Christian way, which was losing its way and falling into ruins. And I think that is as true today as it was back 800 years ago in the time of Francis of Assisi. So who was he? He was born in 1882, Giovanni, but people called him Francesco, meaning the Frenchman, because his mum was Italian. He died when he was 44, and he was a monk for 20 years. When he was younger, he was a bit of a playboy, right? He loved rich clothing. His father was a cloth merchant and would travel often to France and would bring Francis with him. And Francis loved the troubadours and fine life, and he really, really wanted to be a hero, as many young men and women do. He wanted to be a hero, so he became a knight and went and fought and got captured. And because he was a nobleman, he was put in prison and there was a ransom on him. And he ended up in prison for over a year in a dungeon. I can imagine that the dungeons were pretty awful. And there was something about this experience, and he got very, very sick, that transformed him. And when he came out, when the ransom was paid, and he came back to his family in Assisi, in Italy, he was a very changed man. He wasn't so interested in the town square and all the social stuff. He would walk a lot on his own, and he started having a lot of conflict with his dad. In the end, he starts being really devoted to the religious life, and this brings conflict. This is one of the things I want to say today, which is Francis says you can't serve two masters. I don't know if he said that actually, but when I think about him, he points out clearly, because he chose poverty and to live a completely religious life, you can't serve this world and serve God. And he ended up in conflict with his father because he kept giving cloth away and giving money to the poor and the beggars. And it ended up with a lot of fights and him being beaten and locked in the cellar and his mum rescuing him and getting him out. And then he was one day praying in this abandoned chapel, and the crucifix on the wall said, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my house, which as you can see is falling into ruins." And Francis, being very literal, went out and approached the bishop and said, "I need to rebuild this church, please give me money." And the bishop was like, "No." So he went and he took cloth from his father and he sold it to get the materials. And his father hit the roof and basically denounced him. And there was a big public meeting in the town square. And in the end, Francis denounces his father, says that Father in heaven is his parent now. And he strips off his fancy clothes, gets naked and walks out the town. Later, he finds a beggar's robe, a brown sackcloth that he ties round him with a piece of string. And we all recognize that because that is, nowadays, a fancier version of that is what the Franciscans wear. And he went off to be a holy man on his own, and he spent about 5 years just on his own. People thought he was a complete weirdo. He would scrub pots in the monasteries. He would beg. He would preach to the birds. He was a bit of a laughingstock, and people thought he was a real fool. He was finding a different way of being in the world, turned his back on his upper class lifestyle, and was trying to rebuild the church, rebuild the way of worshipping in a new way. Now, eventually, he became successful and people started to follow him. And I want to mention one person in particular who is Clare, also known as Saint Clare. So Francis wasn't on his own. He had companions, and one of his main companions was a noblewoman called Clare. Now, I've got a little bit about her that I pulled off Wikipedia. She was born in 1194 and died in 1253, so she lived for about 30 years after Francis. And as a teen, she heard Francis preaching during a Lenten service and asked him for help to live her life in a manner of the gospel. And then on Palm Sunday in 1221, I think it was, she left her father's house and, accompanied by her aunt, went to find Francis in a chapel. There she joined him, her hair was cut, she exchanged her rich gown for a plain robe and a veil, and she founded the Poor Clares. Now, there are many Franciscans, and there's three main forms. There's the Franciscan brothers, the sisters, the Poor Clares, and then there's this third tertiary order, because so many people came to Francis that had children and people dependent on them, that he created a third order for people who could remain in the world. And there are so many people, even to this day, that follow his way, this different way of being a monastic. So they were called friars. They were known as the mendicant friars, the begging friars, and they owned nothing. They didn't chant the psalms. They didn't have a trade. It was a very radical, different way of living that embraced poverty and has been deeply influential. And I would like to take a little bit of time to tell you about some of the things that are so important to me about this way. Well, one of the things that Francis said is that the brothers should never have power over each other, but that they should take turns mothering each other. I love that they should mother each other and take turns. There's no hierarchy in the Franciscan way. It really is a holarchy, and it is very countercultural. If you take the model of church, Francis found a way of being very free with it. Now, he used poverty, but also that refusing to be in power over and to introduce structures. Basically, the Franciscan way is to imitate Christ, to own nothing and to imitate Christ. And how we do that is up to us. Those of us who follow him have to find a way of, how do I do that in my own life? So there's something very free. It's a very spacious teaching. Now, Richard Rohr in his book says there's two images of Francis. One is this absolutely in service, completely free Franciscan in the brown robe that everybody loves because they really just show up to be love in the world. And then there's the other one that looks more like Friar Tuck or a cookie jar. I don't know if you've ever seen those cookie jars with you take off the head and you get the cookies out, or you see images of friars on beer bottles. And he said that this free way with no authority over you meant that some Franciscans didn't put themselves out too much and really reveled in the world that they loved. And he said that, you really have to have really good supervision and a real commitment to be a successful Franciscan in the world rather than just a jolly one. And I think this is, as somebody who's a freelance minister, I think finding superiors or people who are more learned than you are to do spiritual direction with is really important. Bonaventure, who was a scholar, and he was born 5 years before Francis died, but he's one of the early Franciscans, and he wrote a lot, and he's a doctor of the church, an important person, Bonaventure. He wrote this: "We are each loved by God in a particular and incomparable way, as in the case of a bride and a bridegroom. We are each loved by God in a particular and incomparable way." And leaning into this relationship, I think, is so primary to that freedom. You're not leaning into the hierarchy of a church. You're leaning into your connection with the divine. Richard Rohr says this: "Francis and Clare knew that the love God has for each soul is unique and made to order, which is why any saved person always feels beloved, chosen, and even as God's favorite. Divine intimacy is always and precisely particular and made to order, and thus intimate." And I was going to talk about this back on the Sunday after Epiphany. I was going to talk about the benefits of being a chosen people, that Jewish understanding of being chosen, and Christianity has that too, and it's usually used in a very small-minded, blinkered way of we are chosen and we're right. and I was going to talk about this because there's a whole other side of it, which is I am particularly known by sacred. Not in any way more than you, but it's real and beloved. Like the teacher that loves every child in his or her class and knows what each one needs. It's a very wonderful relationship and that we can actually have with the sacred. I didn't talk about it because the Capitol building was stormed and we talked about that instead. But maybe someday I will go back and talk about being chosen. And I think that Francis really did feel beloved to his God. And there's a quote that I'm a little bit disheveled because I didn't have the internet at home last night and I've just moved house and we discovered one of the beams under our house rotting yesterday evening. So I'm a little bit disheveled in my sermon today, so things are not at the tip of my fingers. But there's a quote in which Francis says, "In my life, I have done what God called me to do. Now you need to do the same. You need to work out what God is calling you and answer that." And I think that's true of this way of being a church that doesn't have power over and doesn't have hierarchy. So the last thing I'll say about being beloved and particularly known, you need to hold the paradox and understanding of yourself and how humans see the world. Yes, I am God's most favorite me. Yes, absolutely. And everyone else is God's most favorite them. There's no better than here. It's just about an unique expression and connection and intimacy with the sacred. Another part of the Franciscan way that is so wonderful, I think, is that there's no power over. And two ways that this are demonstrated in the life of Francis was the choice for poverty and his choice for humility. Now, humility is really, really important. And poverty isn't just about not having possessions that distract you, that have power over you, that then make it difficult for you to go through the eye of the needle. That's a Jesus quote. He said it's as difficult for a camel to go through the eye of a needle as it is for a rich man to go into heaven. It's more than just the things and the money. There's a quote of St. Francis. "A brother has not given up all things if he holds on the purse of his own opinions, the purse strings of his own opinions." It's also about not needing to be right, not needing to be the authority, not needing to be respected. There's a real freedom here. Poverty allows you to be present to this, to the people and to the greater scheme. I think the best way I can talk about this is for 2 years of my life I lived without an income. I decided to put some of these ideas into practice, and I took a kind of vow of poverty for myself for a while to explore what that would be like. I was a pilgrim for part of it. I wrote music for another, and it was very interesting. You know, how much time we have if we're not working. How much time we have if we don't have exclusive relationships. My life became so much more focused on prayer and the people I was with and the season I was in. My life was very interwoven with others because I was in their homes. Their troubles became my troubles, and my troubles, I shared them with them. There was a kind of moving from one family to another, but there was a real intimacy and presence in a way that I don't have in my regular life now. When I lived without money and without a career and a job, I didn't have roles, I didn't have authority over anyone. I remember when I would be home and I would go to my local church, because I wasn't regularly there, they didn't even ask me to wash the dishes in the coffee morning. You know, this was so different after having been one of the leaders in the Abbey, where, you know, preaching on Easter Sunday and people asking you questions. It was so different to be without prestige, to be without being higher up on that religious pyramid. It didn't feel good at all. Didn't feel good. But it was, I think, very, very important in dismantling my ego. And it took me a while to learn how to find a way that I could walk alongside people, but also be in the world in a different way. Just yesterday and the day before, I was thinking about my new life. I've just moved into this new house, and I'm really stressed out, and my eczema is terrible. Now, one thing about St. Francis was he had terrible skin. He had lots and lots of problems. A lot of people know that he got the stigmata on his hands. He identified so much with Christ, with Jesus Christ, that he ended up with the stigmata. But in addition to that, he had all sorts of ailments, and he had terrible skin problems. And I've had infected skin and been in a lot of pain. And I remember standing there yesterday praying about this, and how vulnerable it can feel to be in pain. It's another level of not having security, and just to open in prayer and to show up as broken as we are and be a vessel. It doesn't feel powerful at all, but I think, in fact, it actually is. And that's what got me thinking about this way, which is power with and power together, which, Darwin has used so badly, the survival of the fittest. Actually, Darwin talked a lot more about cooperation. And if you've ever watched a David Attenborough documentary, you will know that the predators are not more powerful than the prey. And just as often, the predators starve as the prey are eaten. In this complex world, power with is really important, and it's not become part of the mainstream of the church because we followed this patriarchal colonized model. And this is where Francis is a welcome breath of fresh air, or a baby sitting in the middle of the bathwater. My favorite example of this is when he accompanied the Crusaders on the 5th Crusade. The Pope preached, and all the religious leaders were preaching, let's go and kill the Muslims. And St. Francis accompanied them and preached to the troops and urged them not to fight. They laughed at him the whole way there. And when he got there, his mission was completely useless because they were going to go and fight. So he walked out into no man's land, gets captured by the Sultan of Egypt, and then spends days in the enemy camp. And the story goes that St. Francis became good friends with the Sultan. And many people believe that this is the root of the reason why the Franciscan orders were permitted access to Jerusalem by Muslims when no other Christians were, hundreds of years later. So Francis didn't stop at the fact that he couldn't change the soldiers. He stayed true to himself, and he forged a third way and followed what was true to him. Now, earlier on, we were hearing about humility. That's one of the core aspects of Francis that I love so much. And it's hard for our ego selves to get our heads around this, actually. And here's some of the quotes that you have to really think about. This is St. Francis. You can show your love to others by not wishing that they should be better Christians. You can show your love to others by not wishing that they should be better Christians. He also says, we must bear patiently not being good and not being thought good. Richard Rohr writes this: all religion without God experience remains immature and self-referential. Organized religion is almost structurally certain to create hypocrites, literally, hypocrite meaning actors. Those who try to appear to be pure and good, or at least better than others. Jesus uses the word at least 10 times in Matthew's Gospel alone. This tendency towards hypocrisy is largely a structural problem, one you can expect to find in all idealistic and spiritual groups, where we are unconsciously trained to want to look good, to seek moral high ground, to see the speck in other people's eyes and not see the log in our own. Richard continues, none of us lives up to our spoken ideals, but we have to pretend that we do in order to feel good about ourselves and to get respect from our chosen group. Any top-down religion trains you in pretending to, denying, projecting your evil elsewhere without wanting you to realize that you are doing this. And I'll have to say that I find this most interesting because I'm trying to work out, where did this colonized mindset come, where you could just go to North America and kill the people and bring slaves over to grow your food for you? Where did this thinking come from that I am part of? Oh, maybe it came down from the distortions within religion created by this hierarchy and this way of misunderstanding what it means to be chosen, to be beloved. Well, there's so much more I could say, but we're definitely out of time. So I want to say that the thing I love about Francis is it's so simple. Love God and love this world. To respond to the sacred world with love. As Francis put it, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. Now, to close the sermon and to get ready for communion, I found the perfect video for us. It's by my friend Christine, and it's a blessing. So we'll move into that now, and then afterwards we will have communion together.
May Christ, who shimmers in all creation, surprise you each day with glittering moments. When you can see again how light lives in everything, how it partners with dark soil to bring forth aster and lavender, rosemary and daffodils, 100 kinds of squash, kale and cabbage, apple and berry, grapes sweetened by the sun. How the dough you knead in your hands is an alchemy of touch and time. How everything is a call to communion. The wafer of moon, a chalice of stars. Let the mystery of it all dance in your heart, always widening your horizons, inhabiting new landscapes. May you know each moment as sacred, and everything around you a call to remember this one true thing.
I love that blessing video by Christine and Work of the People. It reminds me that when we take communion, we're not just bringing holiness into us. Rather, we're bringing ourselves into the holiness of the sacred universe. It's like a personal Big Bang where we join the song of holiness that is being sung out all around us, a calling out rather than calling in.